So the piece I performed also in Tokyo and in the past few days was the Fantasie in C major. So maybe we can spend a few words with this work. It is one of the masterpieces in the Romantic repertoire, of course, and I find it very good to pair with the Sonata by Chopin, because somehow, in my view, I feel that the Fantasie is almost an antidote to the Chopin, to the Sonata. The Sonata being such a, of course, a tragic monument, almost, in a way, almost of ancient Greek proportions, ancient Greek memories. And also the keys are so distant, B flat minor and C major being so far apart. I find them very, very well fitting one program as being really the opposed poles, also emotionally, of course. Schumann's Fantasie is, as he also writes himself, one of the most passionate works he has ever written. And he always writes, he writes at the beginning, Durchaus, leidenschaftlich und phantastisch vorzutragen. So to be played really fantastically in the sense of the Fantasiestücke probably. So with great fantasy, with great ability to respond to the single things that happen in the music. So with great, let's say, responsive ability, responsive will. I mean, what do I mean is that every little change that happens, so for example, and then we have really all of a sudden this sudden change of atmosphere from, so we have this beginning that first goes down. This is, some critics say that this is a sort of homage to Clara, from A to D. Also, the beginning is full of open fifths. And in the bass we have a G. And it creates a very open horizon, very open atmosphere for the music to develop. So we have this A, D that is then mirrored by the right hand. So also here we see some geometry at the beginning. We see some, let's say, symmetric relationship between left and right hand that gives this very open feeling. And the other great thing is that although starting on a G, this, now we are getting a little bit technical, but the piece is in C major, so if we start on a G, we expect the chord of G major, but we don't have a B. We don't have the note B, until here. And here finally we have a dominant chord that we were waiting for such a long time, and we would imagine something that would resolve. No, it doesn't resolve, it stays. C major, we never have a resolution, and the only resolution that we have actually happens 12 minutes later, only at the end of the movement. So only here we will actually have a C major finally resolving the piece. So this piece is really about a very long arch of longing, a very long way of saying I want something, and I cannot have it. For 12 minutes, he wants something. He wants probably eternal love from Clara, or this feeling of infinite. And so it's, of course, the beginning is, as he says himself, phantastisch and leidenschaftlich, so with great passion and with great fantasy, with great element of unpredictability as well. And,
can I ask,
yes,
you mentioned unpredictability,
yes,
which I completely agree.
Yes.
But the Schumann is not widely known as a composer who composed very large-scale pieces, like sonata or concerto. So he's basically known for shorter pieces, like phantastisch or Kreuzleriana. So, but this piece is very big, has a big structure.
Yes.
So what is special about this piece?
This is a very good question. He, first of all, this piece is a piece with many dedications. Somehow, is dedicated to Liszt. It's somehow spiritually dedicated to Clara, but also it was written at the beginning as a dedication to Beethoven.
Yes.
As you probably know, they were trying to build this monument, and so they're trying to fund, to raise funding, and he wrote this piece as a memorial. I think it also had some titles, specific titles like Ruins, and now I cannot remember exactly, but it was dedicated to the memory of Beethoven. And so being dedicated to the memory of Beethoven obviously required, in his fantasy also, a larger scale work. And the way Schumann always had a strange, as you said, peculiar relationship with larger forms. So of course he wrote sonatas as well, but also the sonatas themselves are rather peculiar in the way they are constructed, and this is no exception. So he calls it fantasy, not sonata, although being in 3 movements. And for example, the first movement also has a lot of surprises. For instance, the way he builds also this long arch. So we start with this moment, then suddenly we get into, which is a very triumphant, almost exclamation, but that has little to do with what we had before. So it's a new, and then this gets developed, and then in the middle of this movement we have something completely unusual, which is this Im Legenden tone, which is, in a way, it is a way also to create a narrative structure. Schumann was, of course, very related always to literary influences, and this is no exception, to put something like so this comes from this motif that was introduced before, but still is completely metamorphosed here. And this creates really like an inner, almost another story in the story, right? It's like another layer inside, right? And the way he creates also this legendary atmosphere with just much less somehow movement, much less notes, very pure harmonies. Also when he goes almost like choir-like in a way, much more in a way detached almost. So this always somehow reminded me of a very ancient tale, somehow, something very old, something, of course he writes in Legenden, so something related maybe to a myth, to a more distant in time.
So I guess, so this movement, first movement, has lots of different motifs.
Yes.
Lots of metamorphoses.
Yes.
So, well, it may be not so easy to make it sound like a big thing, 12 minutes piece. Yes,
but I think somehow the most important element, I think, in this music, because it's so varied and so unpredictable. I think the most important element is really to believe in it, and so to be very present, very active, very reactive to all what happens. Of course, this is a general rule that can be applied to anything, but maybe there are different types of music that requires different characteristic also from the player. You know, for example, when you play, I don't know, a very descriptive prelude by Debussy or something like this, you can be, maybe you must be in a way much cooler, much more controlling what is happening, in a way less involved, I would say, emotionally, but more involved with the nature of how sounds are related. Whereas in this music, really the way you are using your rhetoric is almost more important than what you say. Of course, what you say is very important, but really the commitment, I think, is what creates this atmosphere that somehow then binds this. That, as you say, otherwise it would sound, oh, one piece, it's a little unrelated. So you really have to enter the character, you really have to enter this somehow narrator voice in order to switch from one personage to another, you know, to create a story that makes a plausible sense. And it's not just a sense of structure, of course. It's not just a constructed sense. It's really much more an imagined sense. It's not only how now I put this element with this element.
So I feel that at that time, 1830 something.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. So it was amazing that he composed this kind of a almost revolutionary style.
Yes.
After the classical period.
Mm-hmm.
And Schubert is still kind of classical period, but this is completely new.
Yes, this is very new, and I think a crucial element is. I think I read somewhere that he was, you know, when he was a youngster, he was doing a lot of playing, like characterizing people. So he would, I don't know, see people, friends, family, and so on, and just play them somehow, which is something maybe one could say not very serious, but very artistic in a way. It's something maybe more what a jazz player would do today. So he would imagine, I don't know, some friends, and you know, so really try to transpose characters in music, and this is very typical for his shorter pieces, Carnaval, also Kreisleriana. But obviously, when a person has such tendency, this comes out everywhere in his music. He cannot avoid this characteristic of his. So I think this played a very important role in somehow finding this freedom. Of course, starting with smaller pieces, variations, abeg, papillon, you know, intermezzi, yes, of course, some etudes, some more Charakterstücke, which were becoming popular in the time, but then also larger forms that somehow include also these elements.
I see. Because yes, I think up until like Opus 10 or something, most of his pieces were very short.
Yes.
And it feels as if he was avoiding big structure, or he was trying to, he didn't like big structure. His main strategy is to avoid structure and to emphasize the momentary impact.
Very good. Momentary impact, I think it's a very good way of putting it. I think there are different ways to talk about structure. So structure, you know, even in an architecture, for example, there are very different ways to create a tall building. It can be all one block, all very similar. It can be very different, the base and the top. It can be of different colors, of different shapes, of different even elements. So there are different ways to build a structure. It can be built by similarity. It can be like, I don't know, more like in the Mozart sonatas, where, for example, the themes don't have such a big difference like in the Beethoven sonatas, where they often are in completely different, almost distant keys or very different characters. So they both create a structure, but it's a very different type of structure. So Of course, then in the Romantic era, structures somehow tend to become longer. And when something becomes longer, you also find probably different ways of creating this long narrative. Also because the moment it's longer, you know, the moment something is longer, you are also experimenting more with time. Because the moment something is longer, you have more time to say something. And also the listener has to listen not to 5 minutes, but to 12 minutes. And it's a very different experience. So you feel these moments with different types of feelings. Sometimes can be the same thing being felt, but it's difficult to write 15 minutes with the same. So people come up, I mean, Schubert is one person that stays with this. He just explores maybe different keys, different colors, different textures. But Schumann is really, as we said, really something that with momentary impacts. I like this momentary impact. So he tries to create longer structures. Yes.
So I think before this piece, he composed 3 piano sonatas, and I think at that time most people didn't appreciate those music. They thought he did not know what to do. But he didn't study Beethoven enough, you know. So that was kind of responses he received. But do you see still attraction in those pieces?
Oh, yes. Especially, well, I think the most famous of the 3 is probably the second sonata, which often you see, not everyone is the same. You don't need to copy someone. I think everyone in the end, thank God he didn't copy Beethoven, right? Otherwise we wouldn't have Schumann. He doesn't need to copy anyone. But sometimes when people have problems, let's say, with longer structures, and maybe this happens also with some Scriabin sonatas from the late period especially, then the most successful ones are the ones that are more compact. So for example, in Scriabin's case, number 9, which is shorter than 7th, 8th, 6th and 10th, is somehow being so compact, it gives a very unite idea, it's probably the one that also became more widely performed from these later works. And in Schumann, it's a similar case with the second sonata being more compressed, more compact, and somehow more very clear. There is a very clear impact of each of the movements. Whereas maybe in the other sonatas, every movement develops in a longer way. The opening impact is not as strong, and that's why perhaps it took longer time also to be received. You know.
Yes, although I like number 1 and number 3 very much personally.
Yes.